It started with a scream, not the kind that echoes through alleyways in the middle of the night, but the sharp, sudden kind that slices straight through the fabric of a city pretending it's safe. It was spring in Manhattan, 1989, one of those dusky evenings when streetlights blink awake before the sun's even fully set, when the air smells like blooming concrete and sweat. Kairo Benton wasn't screaming. He was laughing, barely 15, with his hoodie unzipped and sneakers scuffed from chasing his friends down the paved path that curved through Central Park like a ribbon. It was one of those nights that felt like freedom when you're a black kid in a city that never stops watching you. Freedom with limits you can't name but always feel. Micah, the youngest, had tripped and skinned his knee trying to keep up with the rest. Zion doubled over in laughter while Tariq threw shade about how slow he ran. Jude just smiled that knowing smile, like he saw everything and said nothing. And Kairo? He sat on the park bench catching his breath, listening to the pulse of the city just beneath the wind. They didn't hear the scream. Not at first. They heard the sirens. 10 blocks away, a woman lay unconscious in the dirt, bleeding from her scalp, clothes torn, breath shallow. A jogger, white, wealthy. And in this city, that combination had gravity, enough to bend the truth toward itself. Police cars fanned out like predators. Flashlights danced between bushes and trees, searching not for evidence but for suspects that fit a shape. Black, male, young. And they found 5 sitting on a bench, laughing, running earlier, sure, but what boy doesn't run? That didn't matter. The hand on Kairo's shoulder was cold, hard, fast. He flinched instinctively. Confused breath caught in his throat before the words came. "What's this about, sir?" But they weren't listening. "What were you doing in the park tonight? Where were you at 8:15? Who else was with you?" They didn't read him his rights. They didn't ask if he had a lawyer. They didn't tell him why they were cuffing him, only that they needed answers. The city didn't ask questions either. It filled in the blanks with headlines. Central Park horror, teens accused in jogger attack. Wolfpack, youth violence spirals, city demands justice. But none of those headlines said his name, and none of them asked if he did it, because by the time the truth was ready to speak, they had already called him a monster. The room was colder than it should have been. Not physically, no, but in that way only certain spaces feel cold, even when they're not. The paint on the walls was chipping. The clock was ticking too loud. The chair Kairo sat in creaked every time he shifted, and across the table the detective smiled like a man who already knew the ending to the story he was writing. But Kairo wasn't telling one, he was living it. "You don't need a lawyer if you didn't do anything wrong," that's what they told him. Again and again and again for hours. His mother, Denise, hadn't been called, his rights hadn't been read, and every question wasn't really a question, it was a trap disguised as help. "Your friends already talked. They said you were the one who started it. Just say it. We'll let you go home." He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he didn't trust that anyone was actually listening. Across the city, headlines were already printing. Cameramen were setting up outside the station. A prosecutor rehearsed her lines in front of a mirror while a typewriter clacked away in the next room, sealing the fate of 5 boys who didn't yet understand what was being taken from them. In the eyes of the city, this wasn't a case. It was a performance, and they had already cast the roles. Kairo's name wasn't trending. His face wasn't blurred. His silence wasn't respected. But in that moment, beneath the fluorescent lights, the threat, the trap, the pressure, he stared at the detective and whispered, "I didn't do anything." And it didn't matter. Because some people don't want the truth. They want someone to blame. But what would you say if no one planned to believe you no matter what came out of your mouth? By the time Kairo left the interrogation room, the sun had long disappeared, and the hallway lights cast more shadows than clarity. His wrists were sore from the cuffs, not because they were tight, but because they had stayed on too long. And even as he walked, escorted between 2 silent officers, he still didn't know, was he under arrest or was this still just a conversation? But he could feel it, in the silence, in the way everyone looked at him but didn't see him, in the way his name was never said aloud, only typed, filed, whispered behind closed doors. In the DA's office across town, Assistant District Attorney Karen Whitmore poured herself coffee she wouldn't finish and skimmed the thin folder marked Kairo Benton, M. Black, age 15. It wasn't a file. It was a script, and she had no intention of rewriting it. "They're all in it," she said flatly. "I want felony charges for every single one." "There's no physical evidence," a junior assistant muttered. She didn't even look up. "Public wants blood. Let's give them something red." The next morning, Kairo stood in a juvenile courtroom wearing the same hoodie he had been arrested in. It was wrinkled, stained, still smelled like the park. His mother sat behind him, her hands clenched tight in her lap, trying to remember if the judge was someone they could trust, or just another person in a long list of people who would smile while slicing her son's future apart. The public defender, who'd met Kairo 20 minutes before the hearing, fumbled through legal jargon he barely believed in himself. "Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence." But the prosecutor cut him off. "We have multiple corroborated statements." The boys placed themselves at the scene. Their stories align with the timeline. It wasn't evidence. It was theater, and they'd rehearsed their lines perfectly. There was no jury, there was no cross-examination, just a gavel, a nod, a sentence. 7 years. Kairo blinked. 7 years. For what? There had been no trial, no confrontation of witnesses, no admission, no fingerprints, no DNA, just fear, skin color, and the kind of silence that screams in courtrooms and never gets cross-examined. Outside, reporters scribbled soundbites. "Justice served in Central Park assault. Youth violence reaches breaking point. 5 black teens convicted." Inside, Kairo's mother held him one last time before they led him away, whispering through tears that this wasn't the end, that she would fight, that she would find someone who would listen. He nodded, not because he believed her, but because he didn't know what else to hold on to, and as he stepped through the side door of the courtroom in chains he didn't earn, he thought of just one question. If the truth didn't matter today, would it ever matter again? They didn't take him to a prison. Not at first. They called it a juvenile facility, as if softer words could change the hardness of concrete. Kairo stepped into the building and knew. Whatever childhood he had left didn't make it past the front gate. The air was thick with the sharp scent of bleach and something older, something like fear that had lived there too long to leave. His room wasn't a cell, they told him. It was a unit. But the door locked from the outside, the toilet was in plain sight, and the ceiling flickered every night as if even the lights weren't sure they wanted to stay. He had a bunkmate, 17, tattooed, didn't talk much, just watched, like a man waiting to see which version of Kairo would survive the first week. The rules were simple. Lights out at 10, no talking after lights out, no touching the walls, no questions. He broke none of them, and they broke him anyway. Not with fists, at least not at first, but with the kind of routines that strip a name into a number, the kind of quiet that feels more violent than noise, the kind of order that doesn't ask for obedience. It assumes it. Kairo stopped counting days after the 30th. There were no calendars. Time was a hallway with no doors, only checkpoints. The meals were the same every day, and so were the guards, and so was the sky. But there was one thing that wasn't the same, the library. It was small, dusty, ignored, and for some reason unlocked more often than not. He didn't plan to go. He just ended up there one evening trying to escape the noise in his own head. And that's when he found it. A book on law. Introduction to Constitutional Rights. He opened it. Not because he understood it. He didn't. But because for the first time in weeks, something in front of him wasn't trying to control him. It just existed. Quietly. Waiting to be understood. He started reading every day, not just law, everything history, psychology, cases that sounded too much like his. He didn't talk about it, didn't tell the others, because there's a kind of healing that doesn't make noise, a kind of rebellion that doesn't look like fire, but still burns. One night his bunkmate finally spoke. "You think they'll let you out early because you're smart?" Kairo didn't answer. He closed his book, turned off the light, laid down, and stared at the ceiling flickering above him. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't cry himself to sleep. He just listened. To the silence. To the pages in his head. To the truth that nobody else wanted to hear. The truth was, no one told Kairo to start reading. No counselor pulled him aside and said, "If you want to survive this, learn something." No mentor handed him a book and whispered, "This is how you get out." What happened instead was simpler, quieter. He ran out of ways to think about what had been done to him, and in the stillness of that emotional dead end, he reached for something, anything, that made him feel like the world didn't end in the 4 cinder-block walls that defined his life now. The library became his sanctuary, not in the romanticized sense where light streamed through barred windows onto old pages, but in the desperate sense, a room that didn't speak, didn't accuse, didn't assign guilt or demand remorse. It just stood there, with its unalphabetized shelves, its broken heater, and its forgotten knowledge, waiting for someone to care that it still existed. At first, he read for noise, for distraction. Books became a kind of white noise against the weight of the days, legal codes, trial transcripts, dusty psychology texts from the 70s. But then, slowly, a shift occurred. He wasn't just reading to forget anymore. He was reading to understand. Understand why a confession he never gave was treated like gospel. Understand how 5 teenagers could be convicted with no DNA, no witnesses, no time to defend themselves. Understand what reasonable doubt really meant and why it hadn't saved him. It wasn't just the books that changed him, though. It was what the books revealed. A system so carefully built on procedure and paper that even its cruelty had citations. And he wasn't outside it anymore. He was inside the gears, watching how it crushed people not with malice but with habit. That realization, slow, steady, seeping into his bones, was more terrifying than anything he had felt during the trial, but it also gave him something else. Clarity. When GED classes opened in the fall, Kairo signed up, not because he believed it would undo the sentence stamped into his life, but because he'd realized that surviving this place wasn't enough. If all he did was wait for the years to pass, then they didn't just take his freedom, they'd take him too. He passed every exam, quietly, no fanfare, no teacher marveling at his intellect. He wasn't the poster child for rehabilitation. He was just a number who kept showing up, pencil in hand, eyes sharp, never smiling. By the time he was 18, he had not only earned his diploma, he had written more legal briefs in notebooks than most paralegals ever would. Still, it wasn't enough, because passing tests wasn't justice, because quoting Supreme Court cases didn't erase mugshots, because being right meant nothing if no one believed you the first time. So Kairo kept reading. At night, he copied down case law from memory. He watched how guards used language as weapons. He listened to the cadence of court TV shows not for drama, but for strategy. And every time a counselor handed him a blank form to reflect on his behavior, he filled the margins with notes about the appeals process. No one noticed, but Kairo didn't need them to, because deep down he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was preparing. For what, he didn't know. Only that when the door finally opened, he wouldn't just be ready to walk out. He'd be ready to speak. The papers came through on a Tuesday. No announcement, no ceremony, just a folded manila envelope handed to him during roll call, with the words, "Release date, June 17th, stamped in red, like some half-hearted apology from the system that stole 5 years of his life. Kairo didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just sat on the edge of his bunk, stared at the words, and let the realization settle in. He was going to leave, but nothing he knew was waiting for him outside. The day he walked out, the sky looked too wide. The sun wasn't kind, the wind didn't feel free, and the city didn't welcome him back. It just kept moving, like it hadn't noticed he was gone. His mother was there, though. Denise Benton, older, smaller somehow, but her eyes still sharp. She opened her arms and he hesitated, not because he didn't want to hug her, but because he didn't know if he still remembered how. When they finally pulled away, she smiled through her tears. "You ready to come home, baby?" He looked past her, down the block where a man crossed the street just to avoid them. "Home," he said. "Feels like another sentence." Over the next weeks, the reality hit in ways the prison never prepared him for. Every job application ended the same. "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" Every stare in the grocery store lingered too long. Every bus ride, every locked door, every denied opportunity reminded him. He was free on paper, but still bound by the perception they gave him at 15. One afternoon, sitting at the edge of his old bed, same room, different man, his cousin Marcus came over, laid back, mouth always running, but this time cautious. Yo, you think about what's next? Kairo didn't look up. I thought freedom was what's next. Nah, Marcus said, plopping down beside him. Freedom's just a word they gave you to keep you out their way. So Kairo exhaled. Then maybe I'll give it my own meaning. And what's that? He finally looked over. I don't want revenge. I want to rewrite the rules. He went back to the books, found free legal clinics, started volunteering, at first in silence, just listening to people who sounded like younger versions of himself, explaining how they didn't do it, how no one believed them, how their lives ended before they ever got to start. And in their words, he found his purpose, because what happened to him wasn't unique. That was the tragedy and the opportunity. It started like most things do, quietly. A law student at Columbia working late on an innocence review project stumbled across an old file, one of hundreds, scanned, mislabeled, incomplete. But something about the details, ages too young, timeline too clean, the words "no physical evidence submitted" stamped in faded ink, made her pause. 3 weeks later, a DNA test that had never been run was finally processed, not because the system demanded it, but because someone outside it did. The result was absolute, a match. To a man already serving time for 2 other assaults in the area, he had confessed freely, voluntarily, with names that didn't include Kairo Benton or any of the other boys. The news broke on a Monday morning. Kairo was in a legal clinic, helping a woman fill out a rental discrimination claim, when his phone started buzzing. Unknown numbers, local news, old friends, and then his mother. He stepped outside into the cold sunlight, phone pressed to his ear. "Baby," she said, voice cracking. "They know. They finally know." He didn't say anything at first, because he didn't know what he was supposed to feel. That night, the city pretended to care, see mayor statements, public apologies, press conferences with solemn tones and phrases like justice delayed and systemic shortcomings. But none of them used the word stolen. No one asked what 15 felt like behind bars. No one counted the years that disappeared like dust into sealed courtrooms. No one knocked on his door. 3 days later, Kairo was invited to a panel discussion at a local university. They wanted him to talk about the process, about healing, about moving forward. He sat at the edge of a long table, suited, composed, flanked by professors and journalists and legal experts, and when it was his turn to speak, he leaned into the mic and said, "You all want to talk about how I survived, but I want to ask you something else." He looked out at the crowd, rows of young faces, some shocked, some shamed, some unsure. "Where were you when I was screaming and no one was listening? Where were you when my truth was inconvenient?" Silence followed. Real silence. Not the kind that comes from awkwardness, but the kind that comes from knowing you're being seen for the first time. Later that night, he sat alone in his apartment, the city glowing through the windows like a world that no longer terrified him. He opened the old case file someone had mailed him, flipped through the pages, photos, transcripts, all the things they used to take his childhood, and on the last page, handwritten, was a note from the law student. "You're not just free, you're right." He closed the folder, not because the story was over, but because he finally knew. He would be the one writing the next chapter. The building hadn't changed. The courtroom still smelled of waxed floors and old sweat. The wood on the benches still creaked in the same spots, and the light through the narrow windows still sliced the dust like judgment from above. Kairo paused at the entrance, not because he was nervous, but because his body still remembered the last time he stood inside these walls. 15 years old, hands cuffed, shoelaces removed, the word defendant whispered like a slur. Now he carried a briefcase, not heavy but meaningful, not because of what was in it, but because of what it meant. He had come back, not for revenge, but for truth. The case wasn't complex. A 16-year-old boy, Darnell Wexler, caught on video being slammed to the ground by 2 officers, unarmed, no resistance. He had been walking home from tutoring, but the city's line was predictable. He fit the description. Same line, different generation. Kairo sat at the defense table, opening his files slowly, deliberately, and then he heard it. A voice, familiar, too familiar. "Good morning, counsel." He looked up. Assistant District Attorney Karen Whitmore. Older now, hair grayer, eyes duller, but the voice still cut the same way, like glass under the tongue. For a moment, time bent. The room blurred. He was 15 again. But then he blinked, stood, and extended his hand across the aisle. Kairo Benton, counsel for the defense. She took it, hesitated, then nodded, too quickly. "I remember you," she said. He smiled, barely. "I'd be surprised if you didn't." During opening statements, she talked like she always had, in facts twisted to feel like truths, in confidence borrowed from power. Kairo waited, watched the jury, watched her, watched the past, trying to rewrite the present. Then he stood, walked slowly to the center of the room, looked not at the judge, not at the jury, but at the boy sitting beside him. They told him he fit the description, but they never described what innocence looked like. They say he ran, but they never say why a black boy in this city learns to run before he learns to drive. They say this was a mistake. But mistakes don't come with patterns, and this is a pattern carved into policy. The courtroom was still. No objection, no rebuttal. Only the sound of something shifting, a narrative unlearning itself in real time. After the session, as papers were packed and heels clicked against marble, Karen approached him in the hallway, quiet, cornered by a version of the past she had helped write. "You've come a long way," she said. Kairo didn't look up from his files. So has the truth, it just took longer. The verdict hadn't even landed yet, but the city was already watching differently. That courtroom had seen hundreds of cases, thousands of names, and too many silent exits. But when Kairo Benton stood in front of that jury, something cracked. Not loudly, not all at once, but deeply. There was no viral video, no campaign hashtag, no viral speech, just the slow, steady power of a man speaking without rage, but with memory. And memory, when spoken clearly enough, becomes something dangerous. It becomes undeniable. By the time he left the courthouse that day, 3 mothers stopped him on the sidewalk. Not to ask for autographs, not to thank him, just to say, "My son, he's going through the same thing." They told me it was his word against theirs. I don't know who else to call. And Kairo didn't flinch. He didn't promise victories. He didn't offer hope dipped in gold. He just pulled out a notepad from his coat, wrote down his number, and said, "Bring everything you have, even if it's just your memory. That's where we'll start." Inside the legal building where he volunteered, the interns began to change how they looked at him. He wasn't just the guy who knew the system. He was the guy who had lived its worst version and somehow didn't let it turn him cruel. During lunch breaks, he would sit alone in the corner of the library, still reading, still underlining, still preparing for something he couldn't yet name, because it wasn't enough to win cases. He had to unteach a generation of lawyers how not to repeat the same verdicts they inherited. One night, while preparing for cross-examination, he received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside, a photo, faded but unmistakable, him, 15, in the holding cell, eyes wide, lips pressed tight, shoulders too square for someone that's scared, and on the back 4 words scribbled in red ink: "You were never invisible." He stared at it for a long time, not because he remembered that day, but because he never forgot what it stole. Later, while walking home past the courthouse, a young officer, barely older than he had been when arrested, nodded at him and said, "Mr. Benton, good win today." He paused, turned back. "Thank you. And remember, your badge doesn't protect you from becoming part of the problem. Only you do." The officer nodded again, this time slower, like he understood. Kairo didn't smile, not because he wasn't proud, but because pride wasn't the point. The point was this: he had been called a monster. He had been locked away. He had been forgotten. And now, he was being remembered for what they tried hardest to erase. The auditorium wasn't a courtroom. There was no gavel, no judge, no objections, just rows of seats, the warm hum of stage lights, and a microphone standing in the center like a silent invitation to say what had once been forcibly swallowed. The university had called it a conversation on justice. The flyers were tasteful, the panelists were polished, and the room was full of people who had read enough about injustice to believe they understood it. But Kairo knew better, because he hadn't read this pain. He had lived it. When his name was called, he walked to the mic slowly, not for drama, but because the weight of memory isn't something you rush. Behind him sat scholars, lawyers, journalists, even a former judge. In front of him, students, young, eager, hungry for truth. And he gave them none of what they expected. At 15, I stood in a courtroom and watched strangers narrate a life I hadn't lived. They gave me a motive I didn't understand, a timeline I couldn't follow, and a label I never earned. They called me dangerous, because I was quiet, because I didn't cry, because I didn't beg. He paused. They said my silence made me guilty, so let me speak now, not to clear my name, but to clear the space where truth was buried. The room was silent, phones lowered, notes forgotten, because in that moment it didn't feel like a talk. It felt like testimony. Kairo's voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It didn't perform. It cut, softly, precisely, like a blade that had waited years to be this sharp. They didn't ask me what I lost, so I'll tell you. I lost birthdays with my mother, the chance to fall in love as a teenager, the version of myself that used to sleep without fear. But you know what I didn't lose. He looked around. My memory, and memory gum is how we fight systems that pretend they never made mistakes. There was no applause at first, not because it wasn't deserved, but because the audience needed a moment to breathe, to sit with the weight of what they'd just been handed. Because sometimes, when someone speaks truth for the first time, everyone else has to learn how to listen. The panel ended with handshakes and soft applause, with university officials exchanging tight smiles and journalists scribbling last-minute quotes to headline their think pieces. For everyone else, the night had been powerful, transformative even, but for Kairo, it was something else entirely. It wasn't catharsis, it wasn't closure, it was the slow return of breath after holding it for 15 years, shaky, incomplete, not enough. Because telling your story doesn't erase it, it just makes the silence around it louder. And sometimes, even when people finally hear you, they still don't know what to do with what they've heard. He walked through the old courthouse corridor the next morning, not for a trial, not for a case, just to feel the space again. The same stained tiles, the same dim lights, the same creaky bench in the hallway outside courtroom C, where he had once sat with his mother, his hands cuffed and his knees shaking, too afraid to cry in front of strangers. This time the bench was empty, but the ghost of that moment still sat there. He didn't stop, didn't sit, he just kept walking, until he reached the courtroom itself. The door was ajar. Inside, a hearing was in session. A juvenile case. A young boy, 14 maybe, stood at the front in an oversized hoodie and shoes too big for his frame. His mother sat behind him, gripping her purse like it might stop the world from falling apart. Kairo didn't enter. He just watched and remembered. And later that day, back in his office, a colleague came in, excited, breathless. "Did you see they featured you on the front page? Kairo Benton, from victim to voice." Kairo didn't look up. "Is that what I am now? A headline?" The colleague paused, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. "You're a symbol." He closed the file he was reading, folded his hands, stared out the window. "Symbols can't testify, but I can and I will, until no kid walks into a courtroom already judged." That night, in the quiet of his apartment, he opened a folder. It wasn't about Darnell Wexler or any of the new cases. It was his "still there," yellowed, stamped with dates that no longer felt real. He flipped through each page, not as a victim, not as a lawyer, but as a man who had outlived the lies written about him, and yet still felt them echo. He stopped on the mugshot. 15. Eyes wide, shoulders too stiff. The caption read, "Suspect, awaiting trial." He stared at it, then slowly, deliberately, pulled a pen from his desk, and in thick, steady ink, he crossed it out. Underneath, he wrote, "Witness, still speaking." The courtroom was empty now, not just of people, but of noise, of motion, of performance. The walls no longer echoed the sound of gavels and arguments, only the faint breath of stillness that follows something unresolved. Kairo stood near the bench, not as counsel, not as defendant, just as himself. He had asked the clerk for access. No cameras, no audience. Just a moment, One moment, to stand in the room that once swallowed his childhood whole and spit it back out in fragments. The wooden chair, the same one he'd been told to sit in at 15, was still there, scratched, worn, stable. He stepped closer, laid his hand on its edge. Not trembling, not clenched. Still. He didn't sit, not because he couldn't, but because he no longer needed to. What once had been a throne of judgment had become something else entirely, a relic. It no longer held power over him. It now served as a reminder of what power does when left unchecked. He closed his eyes, and he saw himself then, shoulders too high, eyes darting, trying to figure out whether to cry or swallow it whole. He saw his mother, fingers laced, whispering silent prayers through clenched teeth. He saw the prosecutor, the reporters, the headlines, the handcuffs. He saw all of it, and then he opened his eyes, and none of it saw him anymore. Outside, life continued. Cars honked, children yelled across playgrounds. Someone was late for court. Another was begging for mercy. But Kairo wasn't late. He was right on time. He walked out through the side door, the same door he had once been escorted through in chains. This time no one touched him, no one rushed him, no one told him who he was, because he already knew. Back in his office, a new file sat on his desk. A boy 14 charged with resisting arrest. The footage showed otherwise. Kairo picked up the folder, opened it, breathed in, and smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won, but the smile of a man who had survived, and now knew how to fight without losing himself. Because justice isn't a gavel, it's not a headline, it's not even a verdict. Justice is memory sharpened into truth, spoken aloud, again and again, until someone finally listens. And now that you've heard him, what are you going to do with the silence he broke?